This is my true story. I moved in with my son and his wife 3 years ago when my house needed renovations. What was supposed to be temporary became permanent. His wife started treating me like hired help and making humiliating rules. Last Tuesday, she called a family meeting and gave me an ultimatum. My son looked at me and said, "Dad, you have a choice. Either obey my wife completely and follow all her rules, or pack your bags and leave our home tonight." I looked at the son I raised alone and made my decision. I grabbed my bag and left a note that destroyed them. Before I tell you, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I moved in with my son and his wife 3 years ago after my own home needed major renovations. The house I had lived in for 30 years needed extensive work, including foundation repairs and roof replacement and electrical updates. The contractor said the work would take at least 6 months. My son insisted I stay with him and his wife during the renovations. He said they had plenty of space and that I should not waste money on a hotel or rental. He said, "Family takes care of family." I believed him and moved in expecting a temporary stay. At first, they seemed genuinely happy to have me there. My son's wife was polite and welcoming. She showed me to the guest room and told me to make myself at home. She cooked family dinners and included me in conversations. My son seemed proud to have me living with them. He would tell his friends that his father was staying with them and that they were taking care of me. Those first few weeks felt comfortable and normal. I thought I had raised a good son who valued family. But gradually, over months and years, his wife's true nature began to emerge. She started making small comments about my habits. She said I used too much hot water when I showered. She said I left dishes in the sink too long. She said I watched television too loudly. The comments were presented as helpful suggestions, but the tone was critical and cold. She began establishing rules about when I could use different parts of the house. She said the kitchen was off limits during certain hours when she was cooking or cleaning. She started ordering me around like I was hired help rather than family. She would tell me to take out the trash or vacuum the living room or clean up after myself immediately. She spoke to me the way someone might speak to a servant or a child. There was no respect in her voice. There was no acknowledgement that I was her husband's father and an adult who had lived independently for decades. She treated me like a burden instead of a family member who was temporarily sharing their home. My son watched all of this happen silently. He never defended me. He never told his wife to show me respect. He never reminded her that I was his father and deserved basic dignity. He just sat there during her criticisms and her orders and said nothing. When I would look at him hoping for support, he would avoid my eyes. He had become completely controlled by his wife. Whatever strength or independence he once had was gone. He was just an obedient husband who did whatever she wanted. The situation got worse as time passed. His wife became bolder with her disrespect because she saw my son would not stop her. She made more rules and more demands. She said I needed to ask permission before using the washing machine. She said I could only shower at certain times. She said I could not have visitors without advance notice. She was slowly eroding my dignity day by day. She was treating me like a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. I started to realize the temporary arrangement had become permanent, and I was trapped. My house renovations had been completed over a year ago. The contractors had finished the work, and the house was ready for me to move back. But every time I mentioned leaving, my son would find reasons for me to stay. He would say I should not live alone at my age. He would say they enjoyed having me there. He would say the house was big enough for all of us. But I knew the real reason. They were using me. I was convenient. I helped with household tasks. I paid for groceries and utilities. I was useful to them as long as I stayed quiet and obedient. His wife had successfully turned what should have been a loving family situation into a power dynamic where she controlled everything, including how I was treated in what I still thought was my son's home. She had taken over completely. My son had become nothing more than her puppet, and I had become nothing more than unwanted baggage they kept around because I was still useful in some ways. The welcome I received 3 years ago had turned completely cold, and I was about to discover just how cold it would get. Last Tuesday evening, his wife called what she described as a family meeting. She told me to come to the living room because there were important things to discuss. I sat down on the couch while she stood in front of me like a supervisor about to discipline an employee. My son sat in the chair next to her, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. I knew from her posture and her tone that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. She had that look on her face that I had seen many times before. The look of someone who was about to assert power and control. She started by saying the current living arrangement was not working anymore. She said there needed to be changes if I was going to continue staying in their home. She emphasized the word there like she was reminding me that I had no claim or ownership of anything. She said she had been too lenient and too accommodating. She said it was time to establish clear boundaries and rules that I would need to follow without question or complaint. She laid out a list of new rules that she had clearly been planning for some time. She said from now on, I would eat my meals separately from them. She said they needed family time during dinner without me present. She said I would eat either before them or after them, but not at the same table. The rule was designed to humiliate me and make me feel like I was not part of the family. She said this with no emotion, like she was reading from a script she had rehearsed. She continued with more rules. She said I could not have any guests or visitors to the house without her advance written permission. She said if anyone wanted to visit me, I would need to ask her at least 1 week in advance, and she would decide if it was allowed. She said this was her home, and she had the right to control who entered it. She said I had been too casual about having friends over, and it needed to stop. The rule was meant to isolate me and cut me off from my social connections. She said I would now be required to pay rent. She named an amount that was unreasonably high for a single guest room. She said in addition to rent, I would be responsible for doing all the household chores. She said I would clean the entire house, including their bedroom and bathroom. She said I would do all the laundry, including theirs. She said I would do all the grocery shopping and all the cooking. She said I would maintain the yard and take care of any repairs or maintenance issues. Basically, she wanted me to pay to live there and work as their housekeeper and cook and handyman all at the same time. I sat there listening to this list of degrading demands, and I could not believe what I was hearing. This woman was trying to turn me into a servant in what she called their home. She was trying to strip away every bit of dignity I had left. I looked at my son sitting next to her, hoping he would say something, hoping he would tell her this was too much and that she was being cruel. But he just sat there nodding along with everything she said. He was agreeing with her plan to humiliate and exploit his own father. When I protested mildly and said these rules seemed excessive and unfair, my son's voice cut through the room. His voice was cold and final in a way I had never heard before. He said, "Dad, you have a choice." He said either obey my wife completely and follow all her rules without complaint, or pack your bags and leave our home tonight. He said those were my only 2 options. He said he would not tolerate any argument or negotiation. He said I needed to decide right now which choice I was making. I sat there stunned, looking at my son. This was the boy I had raised alone after his mother died when he was 8 years old. This was the child I had worked 3 jobs to support. This was the young man whose college education I had funded by taking out loans. This was the groom whose wedding I had paid for because I wanted him to have a beautiful day. This was my son, who was now giving me an ultimatum to either submit to his wife's humiliating demands or leave immediately. The son I had raised had become a complete stranger who valued his wife's cruelty more than his father's dignity. I looked at my son sitting there next to his wife, waiting for my answer to his ultimatum. I studied his face, trying to find some trace of the boy I had raised. The boy who used to run to me when he was scared. The boy who used to tell me he loved me every night before bed. The boy who used to say he wanted to be just like me when he grew up. But that boy was gone. The man sitting in front of me was someone I did not recognize. Someone who could look his father in the eye and demand obedience or exile. I thought about everything I had sacrificed to raise him alone. His mother died when he was 8 years old, and I became both mother and father to him. I worked 3 jobs to make sure he had everything he needed. I worked as a manager during the day. I worked evenings doing consulting work. I worked weekends doing whatever extra jobs I could find. I was exhausted all the time, but I never complained because my son's well-being was all that mattered to me. I wanted him to have opportunities and advantages I never had. I paid for his private school education because I believed good schools were important. I went without new clothes and without vacations and without anything for myself so I could afford his tuition. I attended every parent-teacher conference and every school event. I was always there supporting him and cheering him on. When he got into college, I was so proud. I took out loans to pay for his education so he could graduate without debt. I worked extra hours to make the loan payments while still supporting him through school. I even paid for his wedding when he got married. The wedding was expensive with over 200 guests and a fancy venue. I could not really afford it, but I did it anyway because I wanted his special day to be perfect. I took out more loans to cover the wedding costs. I figured I would pay them off slowly over time. What mattered was that my son had the wedding he wanted and that he was happy. I stood at that wedding watching him smile, and I felt like all my sacrifices had been worth it. And now that same son was sitting in front of me in what he called his home, giving me an ultimatum. Either become a servant who pays rent and does all the housework and follows his wife's humiliating rules, or pack my bags and leave tonight. His wife sat next to him with a smirk on her face. She was clearly enjoying this moment. She thought she had won. She thought I would submit to her demands because where else would I go? She thought I had no choice but to accept whatever treatment she decided to give me. But as I sat there looking at both of them, something became very clear to me. I did have a choice. I could choose to keep my dignity even if it meant leaving. I could choose freedom over humiliation. I could choose to walk away from people who did not value me or respect me, even if one of those people was my own son. The decision formed in my mind quickly and clearly. I knew what I had to do. I stood up slowly without saying anything at first. They both watched me, wondering what I was going to say. My son probably expected me to apologize and agree to follow his wife's rules. His wife probably expected me to beg for mercy or plead for better terms. But I was not going to do either of those things. I looked directly at my son and said in a calm, clear voice, "I will pack now." I watched shock flicker across both their faces. They had not expected this response. They had expected submission, not defiance. I turned and walked toward the stairs without looking back. My son called after me, asking if I was serious. I did not answer. I just kept walking. I climbed the stairs to the guest room where I had been living for 3 years. I could hear them talking downstairs, probably trying to figure out what had just happened. They had expected me to break. Instead, I had chosen to leave with my dignity intact. They were about to realize that the choice they forced me to make was going to cost them far more than they could possibly imagine. I went upstairs to the guest room and started packing my belongings. I did not have much. 3 years of living in their house, but I had kept my possessions minimal because I never really felt like I belonged there. I packed my clothes into a single suitcase. I packed my few personal items and photographs. Everything I owned fit into one bag. It was sad in a way that 3 years of my life could be packed up so quickly. But it was also liberating. I was not tied down by stuff. I could leave and start fresh somewhere else. While I was packing, I could hear my son and his wife downstairs. They were talking in low voices, probably discussing what had just happened. I imagined his wife was angry that I had not submitted to her demands. I imagined my son was confused about what to do next. But I did not care what they were thinking or feeling. I was focused on getting out of that house and away from people who had treated me so badly. I zipped up my suitcase and took one last look around the room. I would not miss this place. Before I left, I had one more thing to do. I went to my small desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a piece of paper and an envelope. I sat down and wrote a note in careful handwriting. The note was addressed to my son. I wanted to make sure he understood exactly what his choice had cost him. I wanted him to know that forcing me to choose between obedience and leaving had consequences he had not anticipated. I wanted his wife to know that her cruelty and her smug confidence were about to be shattered. I wrote the note slowly and deliberately. I started by acknowledging what had just happened. I wrote that he had given me a choice between obedience and leaving. I wrote that I had chosen leaving because I would not allow anyone to strip away my dignity, even if that person was my own son. I wrote that I was walking out of his house with my self-respect intact. But then I wrote the part that would change everything. I wrote that now he needed to understand what he had lost by choosing his wife over his father. I wrote in clear words that he was about to lose everything. I did not elaborate in that first line. I wanted him to feel the suspense and the dread. I wanted him to wonder what I meant. I sealed the note in an envelope and wrote my son's name on the front. I picked up my suitcase and carried it downstairs. My son and his wife were still in the living room. They looked up when I came down the stairs. They saw my packed bag and they saw the envelope in my hand. I walked past them without saying a word. I went into the kitchen and placed the envelope on the counter where they would definitely see it. The envelope was positioned prominently in the center of the counter. I knew they would read it as soon as I left. I wanted them to read it. I wanted them to understand what they had done and what it was going to cost them. I turned and walked back through the living room toward the front door. My son stood up and asked where I was going. I said I was leaving like he told me to. He said we should talk about this. His wife said nothing. She just sat there watching with her arms crossed. I said there was nothing to talk about. I said he had given me a choice and I had made it. I said the note on the kitchen counter would explain everything else he needed to know. I opened the front door and walked out into the night carrying my single suitcase. I did not look back. I got in my car and drove away from the house. They were probably standing in the doorway watching me leave. They were probably feeling victorious. But that feeling was about to change very quickly when they read the note I had left behind. I drove away from the house, knowing that my son and his wife would read the note within minutes of my departure. I had written the first part explaining that I chose leaving over obedience and that they had lost everything. But the envelope contained more than just that opening statement. The note continued with details that would completely shatter their smug confidence. Details about things they thought they knew but actually had no idea about. Details that would turn their victory into a disaster. The note explained in clear language what was about to happen, effective immediately. I wrote that I was canceling every credit card I had given my son for emergencies. Over the years, I had given him access to several of my credit cards. The agreement was that he would use them only for true emergencies. But I had been monitoring the statements, and I knew he had been using them for luxury purchases, designer clothes and expensive dinners and weekend trips. Thousands of dollars every month charged to cards I paid for. That was ending immediately. I had already called the credit card companies before the family meeting. The cards were canceled. Any charges attempted after that moment would be declined. I wrote that I was canceling the car insurance I had been paying for both of their vehicles. My son drove an expensive luxury car. His wife drove an expensive SUV. Both vehicles were insured under a policy I paid for because they had asked me to add them years ago to save money. I had agreed because I wanted to help them. But now that help was ending. I had called the insurance company that afternoon and removed both vehicles from my policy. As of midnight that night, they would be driving without insurance. If they got pulled over or got into an accident, they would face serious legal and financial consequences. I wrote that I was canceling the life insurance policy that had my son listed as the beneficiary. The policy was worth $2 million. I had maintained it for years, intending to leave that money to my son when I died. I had paid the premiums faithfully every month. The policy was supposed to provide financial security for him after I was gone. But now he would get nothing. I had called my insurance agent and changed the beneficiary to a charity. My son would not see a single dollar from that policy. His inheritance had just vanished. But the biggest revelation was saved for the end of the note. I wrote that the house he had just kicked me out of was not actually his house. I wrote that he needed to check the property deed very carefully. I wrote that if he looked up the official records, he would discover something shocking. The house was in my name. It had always been in my name. It had never been transferred to him despite what he believed. Years ago, when my son and his wife bought the house, they did not have enough money for the down payment. I had provided the money. At the time, I told them I would put the house in my name temporarily until they could refinance. I said it was just a formality to help them qualify for better loan terms. I said I would transfer the deed to them later. They had believed this story and assumed the transfer had happened at some point over the years. But it never did. I kept the house in my name as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The $3 million house where his wife had just humiliated me was legally mine. The home where my son had given me ultimatums was my property. They had been living in my house for years while treating me like a tenant they could evict. But the reality was the opposite. They were the ones living in my house. They were the ones who could be evicted. And that was exactly what was about to happen. I wrote in the note that they should enjoy their victory while it lasted, because tomorrow they would receive official eviction papers giving them 30 days to vacate my property. The house they thought was theirs had never belonged to them at all. My son had been living in that $3 million house for years, believing it was his property. He thought I had given it to him as a gift. He thought the deed had been transferred to his name years ago when I helped him buy it. He treated the house like it belonged to him completely. He made decisions about renovations and landscaping without consulting me. He invited me to live there like he was doing me a favor by letting me stay in his home. His wife felt entitled to make rules about how I could use different rooms because she believed it was her house. They both operated under the complete assumption that they owned the property. But the truth was very different from what they believed. I had never actually completed the transfer of the deed to my son's name. Years ago, when they wanted to buy the house, they did not have enough money for the down payment. I provided the funds to make the purchase possible. At the time, I told them I would put the house in my name temporarily to help them get better financing terms. I said it was just a formality and that I would transfer the deed to them once everything was settled. They trusted me and assumed the transfer would happen automatically, but I never completed that transfer. I kept the house in my name deliberately. It was insurance against exactly the kind of betrayal I had just experienced. I had seen my son change over the years as his wife's influence grew stronger. I had watched him become someone I did not recognize. I had sensed that he might one day turn against me completely. So I kept the house in my name as protection. If things ever went wrong, I would still have leverage. I would still have something that mattered to them. And now that moment had arrived. The home where his wife had just humiliated me was legally mine. The house where she had made degrading rules about when I could use the kitchen was my property. The place where she had ordered me around like a servant was owned by me. The rooms where my son had sat silently while his wife stripped away my dignity belonged to me. They had been living in my house the entire time while treating me like I was an unwanted guest they could kick out whenever they wanted. The irony was brutal and perfect. The $3 million property they thought was theirs had never belonged to them at all. Every mortgage payment they made went toward a house they did not legally own. Every renovation and upgrade they invested in improved my property, not theirs. Every time they told me it was their house and their rules, they were wrong. The legal documents were clear. The deed was in my name. The property records showed me as the sole owner. There was no dispute and no ambiguity. The house was mine and always had been. They had been living in my property while treating me like a tenant they could evict. But the reality was completely opposite. They were the ones who could be evicted. They were the ones who had no legal right to stay there without my permission. They were the ones who had been living in someone else's house while acting like owners. The power dynamic they thought existed was a complete illusion. His wife thought she had control over who could stay in her home and what rules they had to follow. But she had no control at all because it was not her home. It never had been. My son's decision to give me an ultimatum in that house was the worst mistake he could have made. He told me I could either obey his wife or leave their home. But it was not their home. It was my home. And now they were going to learn that truth in the most painful way possible. The note I left on the counter told them to check the deed. It told them to look at the official property records. It told them they would discover the house was in my name. And it told them they had 30 days to get out. The home where they had just celebrated forcing me to leave was about to be taken away from them. The house they thought they owned was about to become the house they lost. My son had been living in a $3 million property, believing it was his gift from a generous father. But I had never completed that gift. I had kept it as insurance, and now that insurance was paying off as they were about to lose everything. The note I left on the counter detailed everything else they had just lost access to beyond the house. I wanted my son to understand that losing the $3 million property was just the beginning. There were other assets and benefits and financial advantages that I had provided over the years. Things he had taken for granted and assumed would always be available. Things his wife had enjoyed without ever showing gratitude or respect. All of that was being taken away immediately. The note spelled out each loss clearly, so there would be no confusion about what his ultimatum had cost him. I wrote about my vacation property in Aspen that they had been using every winter for years. The luxury condo in the mountains was worth over $1 million. My son and his wife would fly there every year and spend weeks skiing and relaxing. They would bring their friends and host parties. They treated it like their personal vacation home. They never asked permission and never thanked me. They just assumed they had unlimited access because I was family. But that property was mine. The note told them clearly that they would never set foot in it again. The keys they had were being changed. The access codes were being reset. The Aspen condo was no longer available to them. I wrote about the beach house they had been renting out for income. I owned a property on the coast that was worth significant money. My son had asked years ago if he could manage it and rent it to vacationers. I agreed because I wanted to help him build some business experience. But over time I discovered he had been keeping all the rental income for himself and his wife. They were making thousands of dollars every month from my property and treating it like their business. The note told them that arrangement was over. I was taking back control of the beach house. They would not receive another dollar of rental income. Their side business built on my property was finished. I wrote about the stock portfolio they thought they would inherit when I died. Over my lifetime, I had built investment accounts worth several $1 million. My son knew about this portfolio because I had shown him the statements. I wanted to teach him about investing and financial planning, but he had taken that knowledge and started counting that money as his future inheritance. He made financial decisions based on millions he expected to receive someday. The note told him that money was being redirected to charity. Every share and every dollar was being moved to organizations that would use it to help people. My son would inherit nothing from those accounts. I wrote about the trust fund that would have secured his children's future. When my grandchildren were born, I established a trust fund for their education and future needs. I contributed regularly over the years. The fund had grown substantial. My son had told his children about this money. He had promised them college would be paid for. But the note told him the trust fund was being dissolved. The money was going to educational charities instead of to my grandchildren. His children would lose the financial security I had built for them because of choices he made. The note summarized everything clearly. My vacation property in Aspen that they used every winter was mine, and they had lost access. The beach house they rented out for income was mine, and they would never profit from it again. The stock portfolio they thought they would inherit was being redirected to charity, and they would get nothing. The trust fund that would have secured their children's future was dissolved and gone. Every financial advantage and benefit and safety net I had provided was being removed immediately. The note ended with a direct statement about why this was happening. I wrote that my son had chosen his wife's pride over his father's dignity. I wrote that when he gave me the ultimatum to obey her or leave, he made a choice that destroyed our relationship. I wrote that treating me like a servant instead of a father had consequences. I wrote that humiliating me in my own house had a price. And this was that price. Everything I had given him and everything I had planned to give him was being taken away. He would have to live with the consequences of choosing cruelty over loyalty. He would have to explain to his wife why the vacation homes and rental income and inheritance were all gone. He would have to tell his children why their trust fund disappeared. This was the cost of his choice. I left the house at 9 o'clock that night with my single suitcase. I drove directly to my lawyer's office where we had a meeting scheduled. My lawyer had been expecting me. I had called him earlier that day right after my son's wife announced the family meeting. I knew what was coming. I knew they were going to give me some kind of ultimatum. So I had prepared everything in advance with my attorney. We had all the paperwork ready to go. We just needed to execute the plan once I left the house. My lawyer and I spent an hour going through all the documents. We finalized the cancellation of the credit cards. We processed the removal of their vehicles from my insurance policy. We updated the beneficiary on my life insurance policy from my son to a charity. We prepared the paperwork to dissolve the trust fund for my grandchildren. We drafted the official eviction notice for the house. Everything was signed and notarized and ready to be filed or sent the next morning. My lawyer said the plan was solid and that my son would have no legal recourse to fight any of it. By 10 o'clock that night, I was sitting in my lawyer's office reviewing the final documents when my phone started ringing. It was my son calling. I looked at the screen and did not answer. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. Still my son. I let it go to voicemail again. Then it rang a third time. I silenced my phone and set it face down on the desk. My lawyer looked at me and said he must have read the note. I nodded. The panic was beginning. Over the next hour, my phone rang 17 times. Every call was from my son. I did not answer any of them. Each call went to voicemail, and each time he left a desperate message. I could see the notifications piling up on my screen. 17 missed calls, 17 voicemails. My lawyer suggested I listen to at least one message to see what he was saying. I put the phone on speaker and played the most recent voicemail. My son's voice was frantic and panicked. He was begging me to call him back. He was saying we needed to talk immediately. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding. I played another voicemail. This one was even more desperate. My son said he had read the note. He said he checked the property deed online and saw that the house was in my name. He said he did not understand how that was possible. He said we had an agreement that I would transfer the house to him. He said I must have forgotten to do the paperwork. He said surely this was just an administrative error that could be fixed. His voice was shaking as he spoke. He was trying to convince himself that this was all a mistake that could be corrected. I played a third voicemail. In this one, my son had clearly realized the full scope of what he had lost. He was crying as he spoke. He said he had called the credit card companies and discovered the cards were canceled. He said he tried to check his insurance and found out the policy had been terminated. He said he looked at property records and confirmed the Aspen condo and beach house were in my name. He said he understood now that I owned everything. He begged me to come back. He said his wife had been wrong to treat me that way. He said we could fix this and make things right. The voicemails continued with increasing desperation. My son said it was all a misunderstanding. He said his wife had pressured him to give me the ultimatum. He said he did not really want me to leave. He said the family meeting had gotten out of hand. He said, please, Dad, just come back and we can talk about this. He said he was sorry for everything. He said he would make his wife apologize. He said they would change the rules and treat me better. He was bargaining and pleading and promising things he should have done before giving me that ultimatum. I sat in my lawyer's office listening to my son's panicked voicemails, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no desire to call him back, no urge to fix things. He had made his choice when he told me to obey his wife or leave. Now he was living with the consequences. I turned off my phone and told my lawyer to proceed with sending the eviction notice first thing in the morning. The next morning, my lawyer sent the official eviction notice to my son and his wife by certified mail and courier service. The notice informed them they had 30 days to vacate my $3 million property. The document was legally binding and left no room for negotiation or delay. It stated clearly that I was the legal owner of the house according to property records. It stated that they were occupants without a formal lease agreement. It stated that I was exercising my legal right to reclaim my property. They had 30 days to remove all their belongings and leave the house in clean condition. Failure to comply would result in formal eviction proceedings through the court system. My son showed up at my lawyer's office later that morning. He came without calling first. The receptionist told him I was in a meeting, but he refused to leave. He said he would wait as long as necessary. He sat in the waiting area for over an hour until my lawyer finally agreed to let him into the conference room where I was working. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. His eyes were red from crying. His hair was messy. He looked like he had not slept. He had clearly been up all night panicking about what he had lost. He stood in front of me and started crying immediately. He said, "Dad, please, I am so sorry." His voice was breaking. He said, "Please, you have to understand." He said his wife had made him choose. He said she had been pressuring him for weeks to do something about me living in their house. He said she threatened to leave him if he did not stand up to me. He said he felt trapped between his wife and his father. He said he made the wrong choice and he knew it now. He begged me to forgive him and take back the eviction notice. I looked at my son crying in front of me, and I felt a cold anger that would not go away. I said, "You chose her." My voice was calm but hard. I said, "When she gave you the ultimatum to pick between your wife and your father, you chose her." I said, "You sat there next to her and told me I had to obey her or leave." I said, "You called it my choice, but really it was your choice. You chose to humiliate the father who gave you everything. You chose to side with someone who treated me like a servant. You chose her pride over my dignity." My son said, "But she made me do it." He was still trying to shift blame to his wife. He said she was controlling and manipulative. He said she had been the one making all the rules about how I had to live in the house. He said she was the one who called the family meeting. He said she was the one who demanded I pay rent and do chores. He was trying to make it sound like he was a victim in all of this, like he had no responsibility for what happened. But I was not going to accept that excuse. I said, "You sat there and said nothing while she humiliated me for months." I said, "You watched her treat me like hired help, and you never defended me." I said, "When she made those degrading demands at the family meeting, you nodded along and supported her." I said, "And when I protested, you were the one who gave me the ultimatum. You were the one who said, 'Obey or leave.' She may have started it, but you finished it. You made the final choice. You told your father to submit or get out. That was your decision, not hers." My son said, "Please, Dad, I will make this right." He said his wife was not even there with him because she was too ashamed to face me. He said their marriage was already falling apart because of this. He said she was blaming him for losing everything. He said, "Please just let us stay in the house and we will pay you rent." He said they would follow whatever rules I wanted. He said they would treat me with respect. He was desperately trying to negotiate some way to keep the house and the lifestyle it represented. I said no. I said, "You have 30 days to get out of my house." I said, "You chose to humiliate the father who gave you everything. Now you get to explain to your wife why you are both homeless." I said, "This is the consequence of your choice." I stood up and walked out of the conference room, leaving my son sitting there crying. My lawyer stayed behind to make clear the eviction was final and non-negotiable. My son and his wife moved out of the house within 20 days. They did not use the full 30 days I had given them. I think they wanted to leave quickly to avoid the ongoing humiliation of living in a house they now knew they did not own. I hired someone to inspect the property after they left. The house was in decent condition. They had taken all their furniture and belongings. They had cleaned reasonably well. They had followed the basic requirements of the eviction notice. The house was empty and ready for me to decide what to do with it. Their marriage started crumbling almost immediately under the weight of lost wealth and mutual blame. My son called me a few times during those 20 days, trying one last time to change my mind. He said his wife was furious with him. He said she blamed him for losing the house and the vacation properties and the inheritance. He said she was saying he should have stood up to me or handled things differently. He said they were fighting constantly. I listened to him describe his failing marriage, and I felt no sympathy. This was the consequence of choosing someone who valued money and status over loyalty and family. His wife left him 2 months after they moved out of the house. Once she realized the luxury lifestyle was completely gone, she had no reason to stay. It turned out she had married my money, not my son. She had been attracted to the wealthy lifestyle I provided through the house and the properties and the financial support. When all of that disappeared, she discovered she had no real love for my son. She filed for divorce and moved out. My son was left alone dealing with the destruction of both his relationship with his father and his relationship with his wife. I sold the $3 million house a few months after they moved out. I did not need a property that large. The house had too many bad memories attached to it. I wanted a fresh start somewhere new. I sold it for a good price and used the money to buy a smaller house in a different neighborhood. The new place was perfect for me. It was comfortable and manageable. It was in a community with people who were friendly and kind. I was surrounded by neighbors who valued me and treated me with respect. I live peacefully now in my smaller home. I have rebuilt my social life. I have friends who visit and who invite me to their homes. I have activities and hobbies that I enjoy. I am no longer living under someone else's rules or being treated like a burden. I am free and independent. The decision to grab my bag and leave that night was the best decision I could have made. Walking away from my son's house and his wife's cruelty gave me back my dignity and my freedom. My son still calls sometimes. His voice is hollow with regret when he speaks. He has tried many times to apologize and rebuild our relationship. He says he understands now what he lost. He says he wishes he could go back and make different choices. He says his life fell apart after I left. His marriage ended. His financial security disappeared. His children lost their trust fund. He lost the father who had always been there for him. He says he knows it was his fault, and he is sorry. But his apologies feel empty because they came only after he lost everything. I listen to his calls sometimes, but I do not offer forgiveness. The damage he did cannot be undone with apologies. He gave me a choice between obedience and leaving. He told me to submit to his wife's humiliation or pack my bags and get out. I grabbed my bag and left with a note that told him the truth. The house he thought was his had always been mine. The inheritance he counted on was being redirected. The properties he used were being taken away. His choice to humiliate me cost him everything he thought he owned. Some choices cost more than you realize until the bill comes due. My son learned that lesson the hard way. He thought he was forcing me to choose, but really he was choosing for himself. He chose his wife over his father. He chose cruelty over loyalty. He chose temporary power over permanent family bonds. And the price of that choice was everything.